Today we are in conversation with Sir Julian Brazier, a former Conservative Member of Parliament for Canterbury from 1987 to 2017. Early in his career he was Parliamentary Private Secretary for the Minister of State at the Treasury. The 1992 general election allowed Sir Julian to rise to rank as Secretary of State for Employment. He became Opposition Whip in 2001 and became spokesman on work and pensions in 2002, and he was briefly Home Affairs spokesman in 2003, before being moved later in the year by Michael Howard to be spokesman on international affairs. Sir Brazier remained on the front bench after the 2005 election as spokesman for transport, shipping and aviation. After his days on the front bench, during the run-up to the 2016 EU membership referendum, Sir Julian Brazier was in favour of leaving the EU. Since leaving Westminster, he has become a voice of Brexit during the wilderness and is now the president of the Catholics in the Conservative Party. This is Niwa, contributor and editor for the Bruges Group. It's my pleasure to have you, Sir Julian.
Very nice to be with you, Niwa.
Thank you. Firstly, I think we need to address the elephant in the room, and that is about the upcoming election next year, or whether or not the Conservatives can scathe off Labour. While many of your expertise in governmental departments formulating policy are inundated, what are some key manifesto pledges that the Conservatives need to maintain, add, or omit to maintain their majority in the Commons?
Well, I think there's really probably three things that I would say are most important, Niwa. The first one is always the economy. People have to believe that we're going to get growth and that we're going to get public spending under control. And that has to include some significant reductions in what the state does. There's no point in trying to pretend we can get greater efficiency savings, although there are areas we can get more efficient. And I would put top of the list, we have to have a fitter population. We have to crack down on junk food and areas that are generating huge extra costs to the NHS through obesity and very large social costs through DWP costs through more and more people every year for the last 5 or 6 years abandoning work on the grounds of ill health. Not only diet, but exercise as well. We need to get back to promoting a healthy culture of more people taking exercise. It's very interesting that none of the Scandinavian countries had high levels of death during COVID, whether they had the Swedish approach or, for example, the Danes who had a very similar approach to us. They all had much lower levels of people going into hospital because they were a fitter population. Another area I would cut on public spending is I think we've got to address the numbers of people going unnecessarily into higher education when they are unlikely to benefit from it and gaining vast quantities of debt in the process. So drive down on cost and by saying higher education is very important and a very important part of our country, but people should be able to get good A-levels to justify going to do it rather than doing, say, an apprenticeship. The second main area I think we need to address is the issue of immigration, where we've completely gone away from the pledges we were addressed on. This is not only about the whole question of illegal immigration and small boats. I, of course, live very close to Dover, because I'm still in my old constituency of Canterbury. But it's also legal immigration. This package announced in the last 48 hours is quite right. It should have really come in a couple of years ago. I'm not necessarily convinced it goes far enough. It addresses the ridiculously low salaries people can do in jobs. It addresses the dependence, but it doesn't address, for example, the issue of students often on very poor quality courses being allowed to stay on for 2 years without any evidence at all that they've got a worthwhile job.
Indeed. Another follow-up question.
I said three areas. I think the third area that we need to address is we need to have a bit more of a frank conversation with people about defence and international affairs. Our election is going to happen at the same time as the American. one, and we have a potentially an American president, if President Trump is re-elected, who has made it very clear he is not as committed to NATO as America historically has been. He may well pull the rug out from under the Ukrainians, which I think would be a disaster. And we have to make it clear that we in Britain would be willing to, along with our allies, immediate allies on the continent, to shoulder a larger share of the burden. And that involves explaining some hard truths to people.
A follow-up question to your one of your policy pledges on obesity. What would you say to the more libertarian wing of the party who would say that this would infringe on people's rights on how they would like to live through their own personal and some sort of lifestyle, if you want to put it like that?
Well, I would say to them a very straightforward thing. A small proportion of them are on the sort of Ayn Rand wing of the Conservative Party, but it's a very small proportion. They're people who simply think we should walk away from collective health care and all the rest of it. But for the to them, I'd say, well, by all means, but the British people don't want that. To the vast majority of libertarians, I would say, how much extra tax are you willing to pay as year after year the health service gets more expensive? Not because people are necessarily getting older. My father's in his late 90s, but he costs the health service almost nothing, but because they're getting less fit and more, and we have more and more obesity. That's what's costing the money. Obesity drives up cancer rates, it drives up diabetes rates, it drives up arthritis rates. There was a recent survey which suggested that almost 50% of all the procedures carried out in the NHS now are as a result of lifestyle choices. To my libertarian friends, I'd say, how much extra tax do you want to pay?
Indeed. A while back, many Cambridge University students had the privilege to hear a speech you made regarding conservatism and spirituality of the Christian faith that made Britain. Could you summarize your speech for the audience listening here today who might have not had the chance to hear your speech to the Cambridge Conservative Union?
Well, what I was basically trying to set out was how traditional Catholicism set up almost all the institutions which have made this country great. Parliament, the common law, the jury system, the Houses of Parliament, the whole concept of habeas corpus, the idea that of freedom of speech, even property rights, they all go back to the original Catholic England. Some of them go back as far as my greatest hero, Alfred the Great. If you look at what the people who had tackled the huge problems that we faced in the 18th and 19th century, when we have to remember, we had children down the mines, we had children as child prostitutes, we had child chimney sweeps who had a life expectancy of 18 months, we had widespread illiteracy. In a single generation, the Victorians turned that round, and they turned it round by going back to traditional Catholic principles. To give you two examples, Benjamin Disraeli was certainly not a Catholic. He was a non-practicing Anglican. But in his teaching, start with his books, he was very clear we had to get back to the kind of structures that existed before the Reformation. His most famous novel, Sybil, we meet Sybil, the heroine, in the ruins of a monastery. She's a Catholic girl in the ruins of a monastery. And he shows how applying the principles which you get, he actually has a visit in one of his novels, Coningsby, to an estate run by an old-fashioned Catholic family. He then shows in parallel how a modern factory owner who lives in the valley with his employees can adopt the same principles back to the original Catholic ideas. The second example I'd give is Edmund Burke, operating in the later half of the 18th century, who was one of the people behind the abolition of the slave trade. He worked very closely with Wilberforce on that. you know, Burke was a man who had had a Catholic upbringing from a Catholic mother. He couldn't be a Catholic in Parliament. He was an Anglican in Parliament, but he married a Catholic wife. And if you look at the sort of things he was teaching, they were very close to Catholic teaching. The central importance of the family as the little platoon, the importance of traditional structure and traditional wisdom carried forwards. We need those ideas today in our increasingly atomized and unhappy world.
To follow on from that last bit you just mentioned, you connect traditional conservatism with like Catholic social teaching in
Yes.
your original speech,
Yes.
arguing that conservatives should prioritize reinforcing traditional structures
Yes.
like family, community, and local institutions to
Yes.
address the contemporary challenges.
Yes.
So, could you elaborate on the specific values and principles from these traditions that should guide conservative policy today?
Well, the first one I'd say is the importance of the family. We need to get out of a position in which both tax and the benefit system are so anti-family. The tax system, we're one of only 3 or 4 countries in the developed world, depending on how small you go down to, that doesn't have child tax allowances, which is extraordinary. The old revenue principle that derives from the Victorian era and that existed until the 1970s, until the 1970s, accepted that the taxability of a family depended on the number of dependents it had as well as on the income. The benefit system was a similar problem. In many cases with poorer families, the benefit system actually encourages couples to break up. Ian Duncan Smith fought against that, but he was prevented by the rest of the cabinet he got a lot of the other the pro-work reforms he wanted through, but he didn't get the family changes through. Alongside the family, we need to encourage the fostering of traditional local institutions. Schools should be much more encouraged to participate in their local community in the way that Aberforth, where you're interviewing me, does. We should take lessons from Catherine Birbalsingh, who runs the most successful state school in the country, some people would say in the world. She's turned an area that recruits largely children from very poor, deprived areas into kids who get places at top universities all the time. She has a portrait of the Queen in the centre of the school. She has compulsory Christian hymns. Parents can opt out of the hymns, but for all those who haven't specifically opted out. She has discipline in the schools. And that's really my last point on the list. We have to get back to the idea that with personal freedom comes personal responsibility. There's no point in giving people extra freedoms if we haven't taught them how to be responsible. The freedom to go and ruin your life with drugs is not only not in the individual's interest, it's also very expensive for the state through the criminal justice system.
Relating to that, how can we encourage individuals of faith then, particularly Christians or Catholics, to play a more significant role in shaping political discourse today?
Shaping political discourse. Well, that's why we set up Catholics in the Conservative Party. We're not a competitive organisation in the sense we're not fighting other organisations for a space. But our number one mission is to persuade Catholics to get involved in public life, preferably through the Conservative Party. We also, our number two mission is to bring Catholic ideas into the Conservative Party. So the more Catholics, the more, again, coming back to where we're sitting now, the more of your contemporaries, Niwa, who engage as you do in public life, the better.
100%. Relating to my first question I asked, on many occasions you have raised the issue of identity politics and work politics, leading culture in Britain especially, being embedded in our institutions and our democratic way of life. So my question is, what should be the steps to root out this problem in our politics?
Well, I think we need to step back from it a little. and ask, first of all, where did wokeness come from? And secondly, what's the situation now? The answer is wokeness has its roots in the Enlightenment. There's a very fashionable idea among a lot of conservatives now that the Enlightenment was the beginning of wisdom. In fact, if you look back, the area I described with children in the mines, widespread child prostitution, opposition in Parliament to banning child prostitution was the era of the Enlightenment. The word Enlightenment was invented by Edmund Burke when he used it as a sarcasm, pointing to the blood on the streets of Paris in the French Revolution. He said, now we see the fruits of the new Enlightenment, which is the idea, and the idea behind the Enlightenment in the political sphere was that we should prioritize certain theoretical principles. The idea, for example, that we're all born equal, which is manifestly untrue. We're not born equal. Some people are born with great advantages over others. The idea we should prioritize these theoretical principles instead of building on the traditional structures which provided stability. So we need to go back to the roots of it and recognize that a lot of Enlightenment thinking is nonsense. We also, though, in parallel, need to ask ourselves what's going on today with these various identity groups. And here, I think we have to be a bit nuanced. The best book I've read recently on conservative policy was written on conservatism, your surname, on conservatism. And interestingly, he's a Jewish writer who has close contacts in both the Protestant and the Catholic community. And he describes how it was Judeo-Christian principles that built the West, not the Enlightenment culture. But he looks at today and he asks a really, really, really interesting question, which is why is Marxism defeating the conservative forces in the universities, which it undoubtedly is, both here and in America, everywhere in the English-speaking world. The evidence is that at university level, there are more students who are now Marxist-leaning, as well as most of the academic, a large part of the academic staff, against those with conservative principles. And the answer, he says, is that if you look at identity politics, Marx actually addresses the difficult questions, gives the wrong answers, but whereas Enlightenment politics completely ignores the difficult questions. It's manifestly obvious to most people that we are not a homogeneous group of individuals, as the Enlightenment people seem to believe, in just working with principles which treat all individuals just as individuals. We are, in fact, grouped. Marx said mostly in terms of classes, and the French Revolution had classes and one or two other groups too. Whereas traditional conservatives accept these groups exist, but believes that the way to solve the disparities between them is not through trying to destroy the classes, as Stalin famously did, killing millions of the better off peasants in the Ukraine. The way to solve the problem is by getting the classes and groups to work together through rebuilding the institutions, as both Burke and Disraeli answered, Burke and Disraeli advocated.
In recent times, we've actually seen a push back against this sort of Enlightenment agenda. The recent National Conservatism Conference is a keynote example of this. We saw a greater number of young conservatives in support of such an ideological shift against the Enlightenment, against this sort of like abstract liberalism. So what would be the steps to facilitate these ideas within the Conservative Party?
Well, we need more people with traditional views to join the Conservative Party. I think there's some signs we're beginning to win the arguments in the Conservative Party. I have a lot of sympathy with some of the people who call themselves the new Conservatives now, people like Danny Kruger, and some of the people who refer to themselves the Common Sense Group, like my old friend Sir John Hayes. But I think also people firmly within the left of the party, Catholics like Chris Patten and John Patten, unrelated but both former cabinet ministers, also argue for traditional family values. We need to, this is really what's needed to get a traditional conservative agenda again, which offers solutions to the problems that we face today of the divisions between different groups. The division, for example, over Palestine. I have a long record of involvement with Middle Eastern Christians, which has led me to be very sympathetic to the Palestinian situation, because I've heard Palestinian Christians saying very much the same thing as my Muslim friends say about what's going on in Palestine. Of course Israel has the right to defend herself. Of course the atrocities that were committed last month were absolutely unspeakable. But we've also got to recognise the fact that if the Palestinians aren't offered hope with the possibility to have decent livelihoods, if they're not offered hope for them and their families, the situation will never find a long-term resolution.
Indeed. Speaking on the New Conservatives, actually, one keynote speech from the National Conservative Conference was from a Member of Parliament, Miriam Cates, on how she wants to promote family values and the traditional social structures in the UK. So she mentions the UK can take inspiration from family-oriented government plans, such as Poland or Hungary, where it's inconceivable that family values are at the heart of their policies. One policy she mentions is that from Hungary, women who become mothers before turning 30 will be exempt from paying personal income tax, allowing Britain to have strong birth rates and not relying on immigration. Could Britain realistically follow suit? And what historical certain past tax policies has the Conservatives enacted to promote the family?
Well, I'm a big admirer of Miriam Cates. I don't know her very well. I've only met her a couple of times. But I think that her fight in favour of trying to get the tax system made more family friendly is absolutely right. I'm not sure I agree necessarily on the detail of that. I think distinguishing between mothers under 30 and over 30 would have might have a perverse effect, because a lot of struggling middle class families simply can't afford housing before the mother is 30. But the principle behind it I'm strongly in favour of. I also support her policy, which has just borne fruit. The government, you asked me for an example, something the government has done after a lot of pushing from Miriam and a number of other New Conservatives, is making it a statutory requirement that schools have to tell their parents what their teaching on sex education is. I mean, there's evidence of schools, some schools producing really awful material for children even at primary school era. One of the reasons I think parents want to send their children here, those who can do so, is because they know that teaching in areas like that is firmly family-based.
I think one key issue in the reason why Britain is not family-orientated and is not family-friendly is, like you mentioned, the issue of housing. Key Christian thinkers have always argued that property is one of the key seeds that grows a family, grows a society. What is the solution to the housing crisis in the UK for young families?
Well, I think it needs to be based on two components. The problem we've had in Britain is that the net migration has outweighed, over the last few years, has actually slightly outweighed the rate at which we can build houses. So we have to reduce net migration and we have to increase house building. Now, how do we increase house building? The answer has to be through planning reform, not going mad and letting people build anywhere, but through genuinely making it easier to build houses. Now, there are a number of detailed points that can be done on that. For example, I think we should consider having a tax on properties where there's developers have got permission to build and don't do so. A lot of, nearly 1 million potential homes are tied up because developers own them, have got permission to build on them and haven't done so. But the two big things are reform the planning system and reduce net migration. We're just in the last couple of days starting to take the right steps on that.
The final question I would like to ask Sir Julian is in regards to the Catholics of the Conservative Party. Could you summarise what the group is all about? Just tell me a little bit about its foundings.
Yeah, it was set up by a group of people closer to your age than mine. The committee are all in their 30s. Apart from me, they wanted an older president for some reason. I'm very privileged. We set it up just before COVID hit. So to begin with, it was all online. It's open to anybody who is interested to sign up for on our website, catholictories.com. It has two aims. The first is to encourage Catholics to join the Conservative Party. We'd also like to see people with from other Christian backgrounds. We'd like to see everybody join the Conservative Party, but we particularly aim to get Catholics to join the Conservative Party. And secondly, we want to introduce Catholic social teaching to the Conservative Party. We have already got a number of our members. I'm not going to list them now, but have been one or two have been selected for Parliament. Several have been selected for council seats, and we feel that this is very positive. And we've now started this outreach to universities and schools. You referred to the first talk that we delivered which is myself talking at Cambridge. A parliamentary colleague, somebody who's a current MP, is shortly to deliver a talk, I understand, at Nottingham University. I'm coming here to Aberforth in the new year.
That's excellent. No. Thank you once again for your time, Sir Julian. It's been a pleasure on behalf of the Bruges Group.
Thank you, Niwa.
Thank you.